Dame Maggie Smith. For 7 decades, that name has meant excellence, meant wit sharp enough to cut glass, meant the kind of performance that makes you forget you're watching acting at all. But behind the countless accolades, behind the roles that span from Shakespeare to Hogwarts, there's a woman who once said something that reveals everything. "I've never felt good enough." London's West End. Late evening after a performance. The audience has gone home, their applause still echoing off velvet seats and gilded balconies. Backstage, in a small dressing room cluttered with costumes and wilting flowers, a woman sits before a mirror surrounded by light bulbs. She removes the wig first, carefully, methodically, placing it on its stand. Then the makeup, layers of foundation and powder that transform her into someone else, wiped away with cold cream until her own face emerges underneath. For a moment, she looks not like a dame or a legend, but like someone who simply wants to be unseen. The performance was perfect, of course. It always is. Every line delivered with precision, every gesture calibrated to the millimeter. The audience stood, applauded until their hands hurt, shouted "Brava" into the darkness. But now the theater is empty and she's alone with the woman in the mirror. And that woman looks tired in a way that 7 decades of perfection can't hide. "The fame is like fog," she once said. "It hides everything and keeps you cold." She's 90 years old now, though you'd never know it from the performance she just gave. 90 years of being Maggie Smith, the Iron Dame, the greatest actress of her generation. The woman who's won every award that exists and still doesn't believe she deserves any of them. This is the paradox that's defined her life. A woman the world calls untouchable who privately believes she's never been good enough. A performer who's won 2 Oscars, 7 BAFTAs, 3 Emmys, a Tony, every major acting honor, yet still feels like an imposter waiting to be found out. "I've been playing old women since I was 35, she says with that dry wit that could be self-deprecation or armor or both. Now, finally, the age of the characters she's inhabited for decades, she adds. "It seems all I do now is play women who sit in chairs. But those women in chairs, Violet Crawley in Downton Abbey, Professor McGonagall in Harry Potter, have become some of the most beloved characters in modern culture. Every line delivered with perfect timing, every glance loaded with meaning, every moment a masterclass in commanding attention while barely moving. The question nobody asks, the one that hangs in the silence after the applause dies. What does it cost to be that perfect for 70 years? To never let anyone see you falter, even when your body is failing, even when you're undergoing chemotherapy between takes, even when you're so exhausted you can barely stand. I like the power of being underestimated," Maggie has said. But maybe that's not strategy. Maybe it's protection. If they expect little, you can't disappoint them. If you hide behind wit and professionalism, nobody sees the woman terrified she's not good enough. This is the story of Dame Maggie Smith. Not the legend, but the woman. Not the roles, but the person who spent a lifetime becoming other people because being herself felt too vulnerable, too exposed, too much. Margaret Natalie Smith was born December 28, 1934 in Ilford, Essex, to a middle-class family that valued education and propriety above all else. Her father, Nathaniel, was a public health pathologist at Oxford University. Her mother, Margaret, was a secretary. They were respectable, hard-working, ordinary. The kind of family where feelings stayed private and ambition was encouraged as long as it remained within acceptable bounds. Young Maggie was clever, wickedly clever, the kind of child who could reduce adults to stammering with a well-placed observation. She was also quiet, watchful, absorbing everything around her and filing it away for later use. At school, teachers noted she had a gift for mimicry and an unusual dramatic sense, but it was more than mimicry. It was the discovery that she could become someone else entirely, someone confident, someone admired, someone who didn't have to be just Margaret, ordinary and anxious and never quite sure she belonged. At 16, she enrolled at the Oxford Playhouse School, where the legendary John Gielgud occasionally taught master classes. Gielgud, one of the greatest actors of the 20th century, a man who'd played Hamlet to audiences that wept, saw something in young Maggie that even she didn't see yet. You have precision," he told her after watching her perform a scene from Chekhov. "But precision without soul is just mechanics. You must learn to bleed on stage while appearing perfectly composed." Maggie absorbed the lesson. Spent hours watching Gielgud work, studying how he could convey devastating emotion through the smallest gesture, a pause, a breath, the way he'd look away at exactly the right moment. She learned that great acting wasn't about big displays, but about control, about knowing exactly how much to reveal and how much to conceal. The training was rigorous, classical, designed to break you down before building you back up. Classes began at 8 in the morning, voice work, breathing exercises, hours of reciting Shakespeare until the iambic pentameter became as natural as heartbeat. Then movement classes where every gesture was analyzed, corrected, refined, fencing, dance, diction coaches who'd make you repeat a single vowel sound until your throat was raw. Students who couldn't meet the standard were dismissed without ceremony, their dreams ending with a polite letter thanking them for their time. The attrition rate was brutal. Of the 20 students who began with Maggie's class, only 8 would graduate. The rest would leave quietly, their names never mentioned again, as if they'd never existed. But Maggie thrived under the pressure, perhaps because pressure was familiar. The pressure to be clever, to be good, to never disappoint. Or perhaps because performing gave her permission to feel things she couldn't allow herself to feel as Margaret. On stage, as Ophelia or Juliet or Portia, she could rage and weep and love with an intensity that terrified her in real life. The characters became safe containers for emotions too dangerous to claim as her own. Gielgud would watch her rehearsals, offering notes that were surgical in their precision. "You're thinking too much," he'd say. "The head knows the words, but the heart hasn't claimed them yet. Find the wound the character is hiding and press on it until it bleeds," Maggie learned. She'd spend hours alone, finding those wounds in herself, the abandonment she'd felt when her mother seemed disappointed in her, the fear that she was ordinary and unremarkable, the suspicion that she was fooling everyone and would eventually be exposed. Then she'd transfer those wounds onto the characters, let them bleed on stage while she remained perfectly composed. It was a dangerous alchemy, because the more she poured herself into characters, the less of herself remained. The more she perfected the art of bleeding while appearing untouched, the harder it became to access those emotions when she wasn't performing. Her early professional years were the traditional grind. Small roles in provincial theaters, playing maids in restoration comedies in Bournemouth, understudying leads in Manchester, doing summer stock in seaside towns where the audiences were elderly and polite. She'd arrive in a new town, find cheap lodgings, rehearse all day, perform at night, then move on to the next theater, the next role, the next temporary home. It was lonely work. Most of the other actors were trying to become stars, networking aggressively, sleeping with directors, doing whatever it took to get noticed. But Maggie just worked. Arrived early, left late, studied her craft with monastic dedication. She wasn't interested in fame, or rather she was terrified of it, of what exposure might reveal. But she had something that made her impossible to ignore: technical perfection. Every gesture calibrated to the millimeter, every line reading exact. She wasn't the prettiest actress or the most charismatic, but she was the most precise. Directors began requesting her specifically, knowing she'd never miss a mark, never drop a line, never let the audience see her sweat. In 1956, at 22, she joined the Old Vic Theatre Company. This was the pinnacle of British theatre, the company where Laurence Olivier, the greatest actor of his generation, held court like a benevolent tyrant, where Shakespeare was performed with reverence and innovation in equal measure. Olivier recognized Maggie's talent immediately, but he also recognized something else, the hunger beneath her composure. She reminded him of himself at that age, ferociously ambitious but terrified of wanting too much, brilliant but convinced the brilliance was somehow fraudulent. He cast her as Desdemona in his stage production of Othello in 1959. It was a test, really. Playing opposite Olivier at the peak of his powers would either destroy a young actress or reveal she belonged among the greats. Maggie was 24, playing one of Shakespeare's most challenging female roles, standing on stage with a man who was already a living legend. The rehearsal process was brutal. Olivier demanded perfection but gave almost no direction, expecting actors to find their characters through instinct and intelligence. He'd watch Maggie rehearse a scene, then simply say, "Again," until she found what he was looking for, never explaining what that was. Some actors broke under this method. Maggie sharpened herself against it like a blade on a whetstone. Opening night, she was terrified. Standing in the wings, waiting for her entrance, she felt the old panic rising, the certainty that she'd be exposed as a fraud, that everyone would see she didn't belong here, that she'd ruin Olivier's production through sheer inadequacy. Then she stepped onto the stage. The lights hit her. The audience disappeared into darkness, and Desdemona took over, innocent but not naive, loving but not weak, doomed but dignified. For 2 hours, Maggie wasn't Margaret from Essex pretending to be an actress. She was Desdemona, wife of Othello, and when she died on that stage, the audience wept. Afterward, Olivier came to her dressing room. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said. "Don't let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." But Maggie couldn't accept it. "I missed a cue in Act 3, she said, "and the blocking in the final scene felt wrong." Olivier laughed, but there was sadness in it. "You just gave one of the finest Desdemonas I've seen in 30 years of theater, and all you can think about are minor imperfections nobody else noticed. That will make you great, Margaret. It will also make you miserable." He was right on both counts. The 1960s brought more roles at the Old Vic and National Theatre: Sylvia in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing, Hilda Wangel in Ibsen's The Master Builder. Each performance earned critical acclaim. Each success convinced Maggie that the next role would be the one where she'd finally be exposed as not good enough. During this period, she developed habits that would define her career. Arriving at the theater hours before curtain to prepare in solitude, studying reviews obsessively, praising ones made her suspicious, critical ones confirmed her fears. Avoiding post-show celebrations because she couldn't bear the small talk and forced gaiety. Other actors would gather at pubs after performances, drinking and laughing and dissecting the show. Maggie would go home alone, already thinking about tomorrow's performance, already finding ways to improve, already punishing herself for perceived failures nobody else had noticed. By her mid-20s, she was being called the finest actress of her generation. But what does that praise cost when you're 25 and already being compared to legends? When every performance is scrutinized for proof you deserve the accolades. When one misstep could reveal you as the fraud you secretly believe you are. In 1963, Olivier directed a film version of Othello, casting Maggie as Desdemona opposite his own towering performance as the Moor. The production was controversial. Olivier in blackface, the racial politics already uncomfortable even then. But Maggie's performance was luminous, heartbreaking, perfect. Critics praised her ability to convey Desdemona's innocence without making her seem naive, her love without making her seem weak. The film brought international attention, Hollywood offers, the possibility of stardom. But stardom meant exposure. Interviews, photo shoots, people asking about your personal life. Maggie hated it. "I'm not interesting," she'd tell journalists, deflecting with humor. "The characters are interesting, I'm just the vessel." But that denial, That insistence she was somehow less than the roles she played revealed everything. Maggie Smith was building a fortress, using characters as walls to hide behind. In 1967, she married Robert Stevens, a brilliant actor she'd met at the National Theater. Robert was handsome, talented, charismatic, the kind of man who could command a stage with pure presence. They seemed perfect together, two rising stars, both dedicated to their craft. They had two sons, Chris in 1967, Toby in 1969. For a few years, Maggie tried to be everything to everyone. The perfect wife attending Robert's opening nights and laughing at his jokes. The perfect mother reading bedtime stories and attending school plays. The perfect actress still delivering flawless performances at the National Theater. But perfection in one area requires sacrificing others. When she was home with the boys, she felt guilty about not working. When she was at the theater, she felt guilty about leaving them with nannies. When she was with Robert, she felt the competition simmering beneath every conversation. Two actors in the same marriage, one ascending while the other struggled to match her success. Robert's drinking, initially social, became serious. He'd come home from performances drunk, pick fights about nothing, accuse Maggie of thinking she was better than him, then apologize tearfully the next morning. The boys would hear their parents arguing through bedroom walls. Robert's voice loud and slurring, Maggie's quiet and controlled, refusing to engage but also refusing to leave. "Why don't you ever fight back?" Robert would scream during their worst arguments. "Why do you just stand there looking at me like I'm a disappointing student? Show me some emotion, Margaret." But Maggie couldn't. She'd spent so long learning to control her emotions, to bleed on stage but remain composed in life, that she'd lost the ability to access anger or hurt without a script. She'd stand there, perfectly still, watching her marriage implode with the same analytical detachment she'd bring to watching someone else perform a difficult scene. Friends who knew them both would later say the marriage was doomed from the start. Two brilliant, insecure people who needed validation the other couldn't provide, who saw their spouse's success as implicit criticism of their own inadequacy. Robert needed Maggie to be less perfect, less controlled, more human. Maggie needed Robert to be more stable, less chaotic, someone who could be the anchor while she retreated into work. Neither could give the other what they needed. The breaking point came in 1974. Robert, drunk at a theater party, very publicly began an affair with another actress. The humiliation was complete, not just the betrayal, but having it happen in front of their colleagues, becoming theater gossip, being pitied by people she'd worked with for years. Maggie filed for divorce the next week. When asked by her lawyer if she wanted to contest Robert's request for custody visits, she simply said, "The boys need their father. I won't use them as weapons." The divorce was finalized in 1975. Maggie was 40, raising two sons aged 8 and 6, trying to maintain her career while her personal life had just publicly collapsed. She gave exactly one interview about it, saying only, "These things happen. One moves on, but she didn't move on. She buried it, added it to the collection of wounds she'd press on when she needed to access pain for a role, but never examined in the light of day. Never let herself actually grieve." Robert was a chapter that had ended. She had work to do. The boys needed stability. There was no time for falling apart when falling apart would prove she'd been right all along, that she couldn't maintain perfection in all areas, that something had to give, that she'd failed. In 1969, she starred in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, playing a charismatic, manipulative Edinburgh schoolteacher in the 1930s. The role was complex. Jean Brodie was charming and monstrous, inspiring and destructive, someone you loved and hated simultaneously, often in the same scene. Maggie understood her perfectly, because Maggie understood what it meant to perform, to wear a mask so convincing that even you start believing it's real. She gave the performance of her life, sharp, funny, devastating, layered with contradictions that made Jean Brodie feel impossibly human. She won the Academy Award for Best Actress. At 34, Maggie Smith stood on that stage at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, holding the golden statuette, thanking the Academy with perfect grace and wit. The lights were too bright to see herself clearly. Maybe that was better. Later in private, she'd say, "I don't think they knew why they were giving it to me." Even winning the highest honor in acting, Maggie Smith didn't believe she deserved it. And still, she didn't believe it was enough. The applause fades, the flowers wilt, the makeup wipes away. Only Maggie remains, and even she's not sure who that is. The 1970s should have been golden, an Oscar winner in demand at the height of her powers. Instead, her marriage collapsed. Robert's drinking worsened. The arguments became more vicious, the reconciliations less convincing. In 1975, they divorced. Maggie was left raising two young boys alone while maintaining her career. She never spoke publicly about it, not about the loneliness, not about the difficulty of being a single mother in an industry that expected women to be either mothers or actresses, but punished them for trying to be both. Instead, she worked. Returned to the National Theater for production after production. Trevor Nunn's Macbeth, where her Lady Macbeth was called terrifyingly controlled. Noel Coward's Private Lives, where her Amanda was all brittle wit hiding genuine pain. Tom Stoppard's Night and Day, where she proved she could make even journalism seem fascinating. While her contemporaries embraced visibility, Maggie hid behind craft. Judi Dench would do chat shows, appear at galas, become a public figure beyond her roles. But Maggie retreated further into privacy, emerging only for performances, then disappearing again like a ghost that haunts theaters. In 1978, she won her second Oscar for California Suite, playing an actress losing at the awards and at life. The role was meta, a performer confronting her own fading relevance, desperately trying to maintain dignity while everything crumbles. Maggie played it with such painful honesty that watching felt intrusive, like witnessing a private breakdown. "I'm very good at playing women who are falling apart," she said in one of her rare interviews. "Perhaps because I understand what it feels like to hold yourself together by sheer force of will." Friends from this period remember Maggie as warm in private, funny in ways the public never saw, but also guarded. She'd deflect personal questions with jokes, change subjects if conversation got too intimate. The woman who could inhabit any character kept her own self locked away where nobody could judge it, find it wanting, confirm her suspicion that Margaret Natalie Smith wasn't nearly as interesting as the people she pretended to be. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Maggie became the grande dame of British theatre. She played old women brilliantly, dowagers and spinsters and bitter matriarchs who'd survived by developing sharp tongues and sharper minds, who'd learned that wit was armor against a world that dismissed them. She understood these women because she was becoming one, channeling her own experiences of being underestimated, reduced to character actress status as she aged out of romantic leads. But Maggie made these women unforgettable. In Lettuce and Lovage opposite Margaret Tyzack, she played a tour guide who embellishes history to make it interesting. A woman who understands that sometimes performance is the only truth we have. She terrifies you into excellence, Daniel Radcliffe would later say about working with her on Harry Potter. Not through cruelty, but through example. You watch her work and realize there's no excuse for being unprepared, unfocused, or anything less than your best. That's what Maggie became. Not just an actress, but a standard. Younger actors like Olivia Colman and Eddie Redmayne would study her performances, trying to understand how she achieved such depth with such economy of movement. She influenced generations not through teaching but through example, showing that craft matters, that precision is power, that you can convey everything while appearing to do nothing. In 2001, she starred in Gosford Park, Robert Altman's murder mystery set in a 1930s country house. Playing Lady Constance Trentham, Maggie delivered what critics called a master class in saying everything while appearing to say nothing. Every glance, Every pause, every slight lift of an eyebrow conveyed volumes about class, resentment, jealousy, and the slow dying of an era. She was nominated for her 6th Oscar. Didn't win, but it didn't matter. The performance reminded everyone that Maggie Smith remained at 66, dangerous, vital, capable of dominating a scene while barely speaking. But acclaim doesn't protect you from the body's betrayals. In 2007, Maggie noticed something wrong. A lump during a self-examination. She was 72 years old, had spent 5 decades being meticulous about her health because her body was her instrument and instruments required maintenance. She saw her doctor the next day. Breast cancer, malignant, requiring aggressive treatment. The diagnosis should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange calm, the same calm she'd feel before stepping onto a stage. This was just another performance, another role to play. The patient. She'd researched the part, understood the stakes, and she'd deliver the performance of her life. She told almost nobody. Not her sons initially. Why worry them when there was nothing they could do? Not the Harry Potter producers. They'd only replace her. Find someone younger and healthier to play McGonagall. Prove that she was, as she'd always suspected, replaceable. Not her friends. Their pity would be unbearable confirmation that she was finally visibly failing. So she began treatment in secret. Chemotherapy sessions scheduled between filming days. She'd sit in the oncology ward, poison dripping into her veins, reading the next day's script, memorizing McGonagall's lines while her body tried to reject the medicine keeping her alive. The side effects were brutal. Nausea that made eating impossible. Exhaustion so profound that standing required conscious effort. Hair loss. Though given she wore a wig for McGonagall anyway, at least that was manageable. The oncologist warned her that continuing to work during treatment was madness, that her body needed rest to heal. But Maggie couldn't rest. Rest meant time to think, to feel, to acknowledge that her body, the instrument she'd relied on for 7 decades, was betraying her. Work meant purpose, meant she was still useful, meant she hadn't yet become the thing she'd always feared, a woman who was once great but was now just old and sick and unnecessary. On set, nobody knew. She'd arrive early as always, already in costume and makeup to hide how ill she looked. She'd deliver her lines with the same precision she'd always had. Between takes, when other actors would chat or scroll their phones, Maggie would sit quietly in her chair, conserving energy, preparing for the next scene. Daniel Radcliffe noticed she seemed tired. "Are you all right, Dame Maggie?" he asked one day. "Just old, dear," she said with that dry wit. "It happens to the best of us." Emma Watson noticed she'd lost weight. "You should eat more," she suggested gently. "I'm fine," Maggie said, ending the conversation with a finality that discouraged further questions. Only the director, David Yates, knew the full truth, and only because Maggie's assistant finally told him, worried that Maggie would collapse on set. Yates approached her privately. "We can adjust the schedule," he said. "Shoot your scenes when you're feeling stronger. Nobody needs to know why." "Absolutely not," Maggie said firmly. "That would be unprofessional. I signed a contract. I'll fulfill my obligations. This isn't about professionalism, it's about your health." "My health is my business," she cut him off. "The work is what matters. Can we please not discuss this again?" They didn't. Maggie continued filming through 6 months of chemotherapy. She never missed a day, never asked for accommodation, never let anyone see how much it cost her. She'd finish a scene, walk calmly to her trailer, vomit from the chemo, clean herself up, and return for the next take. On the day they filmed McGonagall's big duel scene, fighting Death Eaters, defending Hogwarts, being the fierce protector she'd always been, Maggie had undergone chemotherapy the previous afternoon. She was weak, nauseous, running on will alone. But when Yates called action, she transformed. McGonagall was strong, powerful, indomitable. "Cut! Brilliant!" Yates called. Maggie nodded. walked off set with perfect composure, and collapsed the moment she was alone in her trailer. Her assistant found her on the floor, too weak to stand, crying from exhaustion and pain and the sheer effort of maintaining the performance. "We should tell them," her assistant pleaded. "Let them help you." "No," Maggie said, pulling herself together. "I'm not weak. I won't be pitied." But she was weak. Weak and human, and fighting for her life while pretending everything was fine, because admitting vulnerability felt like death itself. Worse than the cancer. Worse than the treatment. Worse than anything, because it would prove what she'd always believed, that she was only valuable as long as she was perfect. She survived. The treatment worked. By 2008, she was in remission, cancer-free, still standing despite everything. The Harry Potter cast and crew learned the truth only after filming wrapped, when Maggie's assistant finally told them. They were shocked, horrified that she'd suffered alone, awed by her strength. But was it strength? Or was it the ultimate expression of the prison she'd built? That even facing death, even when her body was breaking, she couldn't allow herself to be human, to need help, to admit that perfection wasn't possible. Maggie never answered that question. She simply moved on to the next role. In 2010, she began Downton Abbey as Violet Crawley, Dowager Countess of Grantham. It should have been a small role in a modest British drama. Instead, Downton became a global phenomenon, and Violet Crawley became one of television's most beloved characters. Every episode gave Maggie devastating lines, observations about modern life delivered with aristocratic disdain that made audiences laugh and cry simultaneously. "What is a weekend?" Violet asks, genuinely confused. "It's funny, but heartbreaking. This woman so removed from normal life that basic concepts escape her. It wasn't acting anymore." Violet's sharp wit, her fear of being left behind, her loneliness hidden behind impeccable manners, those were Maggie's, finally allowed to speak. For the first time in her career, Maggie was playing a version of herself, and the world loved her for it. She won 3 Emmys for Downton, became a cultural icon at 75, proved that age didn't diminish talent, that old women could be funny and complex and the most interesting people on screen. And still, she didn't believe it was enough. The applause fades, the flowers wilt, the makeup wipes away. Only Maggie remains, wondering when they'll realize she's been fooling them all along. At 90, Dame Maggie Smith lives quietly in her London home. She rarely gives interviews, rarely attends public events. She's become what she perhaps always was, a private person who spent her life performing, who's earned the right to finally step off stage. Her legacy is staggering. 2 Academy Awards, 7 BAFTAs, 3 Emmys, a Tony, every major acting honor. She's a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. She's influenced generations who study her performances, trying to decode her magic. But more than awards, she leaves behind characters woven into our cultural fabric. Professor McGonagall teaching millions of children what integrity looks like. Violet Crawley proving old age could be powerful, not pitiful. Miss Jean Brodie in all her dangerous complexity. When asked about her career, Maggie deflects. "I was lucky. I worked with talented people, but it wasn't luck. It was 7 decades of relentless dedication, of never settling, of pushing herself to perfection even when that perfection cost everything." The question isn't about her achievements. Those speak for themselves. The question is, why couldn't she believe in them? Why, after everything, did she still feel insufficient? Maybe because brilliant women are taught that excellence is expected, not exceptional. That no matter how perfect, someone's ready to find fault. That praise is suspicious while criticism is truth. Or maybe Maggie is just incredibly British, constitutionally incapable of self-promotion, genuinely embarrassed by attention, more comfortable deflecting than accepting compliments. Or maybe the woman who spent 70 years being other people never figured out how to be comfortable being herself. When she received her BAFTA fellowship in 1996, she said, "At my age, you stop worrying about the next role. You start wondering if there will be one." She's had many since, but the truth remains. Even the Iron Dame gets tired. Even the most perfect performer eventually wants to remove the costume, go home where nobody's watching. So what do we owe artists like Maggie Smith? The ones who've given decades of perfection, who've shown us what excellence looks like even when it costs them everything. Do we owe them permission to be imperfect? The understanding that behind every perfect performance is a person who bleeds and doubts like everyone else? The fog has finally lifted, and behind it there was only a woman, tired and enough. She looks into the mirror one last time. No wig, no makeup, no mask. Just Margaret, 90 years old, exhausted, human, and perhaps finally ready to believe what everyone else has known for 7 decades. She was always enough, more than enough, extraordinary exactly as she was, beneath all the roles and awards and armor. The Iron Dame is tired, and she's earned the right to rest. Now she sits not as a role but as herself, in a chair, in silence, in the peace that comes when you finally stop performing and allow yourself to simply be. That's the only standing ovation that matters now. Dame Margaret Natalie Smith, December 28, 1934, present. At 90, she's given us 70 years of perfection. Maybe it's time we give her permission to be human, to be just Margaret, to rest. Because true strength isn't never breaking. It's standing up after you've fallen. And the most powerful thing a woman can do isn't to be perfect. It's to admit she's human and keep going anyway. The woman who taught us about dignity and grace and excellence under pressure deserves that same compassion extended to herself. The lights have dimmed, the audience has gone home, the theater is empty. And finally, mercifully, the performance is over. She can take off the mask now. She's earned it.